That's it recording now. Hi, welcome to this week's UMIP call, community call. As Sean just said, we only have one UMIP to consider this week, which is the binary options UMIP, written by Sean. I'll just bring that up on screen. I think somebody. This was one which introduces the option for us to have a prediction, augur style prediction market. So it'll have a binary query where we can have 3 values of yes, no, cannot be determined. Sean, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. Basically, the idea is you can ask theoretically any question, and it's basically the burden of the person that's requesting the price to make sure that it's a question that the outcome can be determined for. And basically, the settlement process for UMA voters is you just look at the question that's contained within the ancillary data. And if there's a clear answer yes, then you answer the value that's been passed in P1. If there's a clear answer no, then you answer the value that's been passed in P2. And if there's a lack of clarity because the question is poorly defined or it relies on information that's not like widely available, then requesters or voters can answer the value in P3. There's also defaults associated with these values. So usually they would be, actually got P1 and P2 mixed up, but usually there would be 0 for no, 1 for yes, and 0.5 for cannot be determined. But as people have brought up, like Rainus, there's like various applications where this might not be the most fitting thing. So we're also doing something somewhat novel and having the requester themselves pass in the prices that they want returned for various scenarios. That's basically it.
And this is using the new auxiliary data to support this.
Correct. So instead of just having a price identifier and a timestamp passed in the price request, but there's now additional data called ancillary data, which can theoretically contain any sort of information. And here it's patching in a few additional parameters, which are the prices to respond with and also the question being asked.
Yeah. One question, Sean. I'm just wondering, is there also some way for voters actually to skip answering such questions? I could imagine maybe if some contract asks, let's say, some controversial question which maybe politically sensitive or something like that, and part of voters or maybe majority just don't want to engage in answering it, or maybe it's a question of the fees paid by the contract asking it are too low. What's the mechanism for the DVM actually to skip providing response?
Yeah, that's a really good question, something we've discussed. So right now, the only way that you can entirely skip a vote is by not really skipping it, but just not answering it, and it continues to roll and just never gets answered by like more than 5% of UMA voters. But as kind of a hacky way to do that, that's part of the reason why we put in the cannot be determined answer. So it'd still return a value, but assumably it'd be less useful for the financial contract. But I know John had some ideas about like whatever. sitting out of votes and having that actually be like a right answer that you potentially get rewarded for.
Well, I think that is basically the P3 thing. Like if it can't be determined, if it's like, I mean, politically sensitive is one thing, but if it's like a disputable question where it's not clear whether it's a yes or no, which could be political or could not be, then I think you would just go with a P3 value. As for like whether something is controversial or not, and so you don't want to return an answer, you know, I do think it just goes back to like the quorum thing. Like if fewer than 5% of voters actually vote on it, then it's not going to be determined as anything. And I could see that coming up with more traditional price identifiers too, where like some contract is requesting a price of like some cryptocurrency, but like the contract itself is nefarious. It's like dividing up the spoils of like hacking, and like the hackers agreed to put it in this smart contract that's then calling and saying like, what's the price of Bitcoin though? Like how do we divide up our hacking spoils? Like that could also be a similar kind of thing where we might just say, we're just gonna abstain from helping you on this one. So I don't think it's necessarily only for this UMIP that could come up.
I agree.
Sure.
And also the lack of paying fees with the optimistic oracle, like that's something that's present in all identifiers, and is kind of like it's like at the behest of like UMA voters. People can choose just not to respond, and then the financial contract's kind of in limbo.
Cool. Any other questions about the binary query price identifier?
I need ideas for a better name because binary query kind of sucks. Also, I'm wondering if people think it would be useful if instead of just allowing for like one question and answer process, you could like group certain subsets of questions and assign weights for all of those questions, and then return like the values, or assign like price values for all of those questions, and then like return like groups of answers instead of like only singular answers.
Could you give an example of where that might be useful, Sean?
Sure. I think theoretically it could be useful in something like a generalized KPI options price identifier. So if I wanted to ask a few questions about a financial contract, like did this financial contract's TVL ever get above $50 million? Was, you know, no money hacked out of this contract? Were all liquidations performed correctly? And then I basically wanted to put like, you know, multiple definitions of success on this one price identifier for these KPI options, and then assign like different weights or payouts associated with success on like individual portions of that. Then you could define like multiple questions and multiple prices associated with that, and voters would basically be instructed to return like the sum of the three, or all of the answers within. Does that make sense?
So it will be like kind of multiple question query, right?
Yeah, or it could be used exactly as defined right now if only one question was passed in.
So would the logic go in the one question? So like if all of these are yes, then answer yes, or would it be completely separate questions, so effectively multiple binary queries?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of them as completely separate, and it was like if you answer yes to this one, then you know, P1 is your value for this item in the list. Then you answer no for the next one, and you return P0, and then you add up your return values from each of the items in like the question list, and then you return like the sum of all.
I think since you're able to define the ancillary data however you want, I think that you could actually ask this as like and or, like it's sort of like a logical structure to the question that you're asking. So it's like, did TVL hit this mark, or did it not get hacked, or, you know, were all liquidations performed correctly? And maybe only one of those three actually hit, but you answer yes because one of those three hit, and then you're returning like an array then of like values that you could add up. So like TVL, you didn't hit the mark, so that one's 0. It got hacked, so that one's 0, but you performed all liquidations correctly somehow with it getting hacked, so that one's like 1. And so then you would add those three numbers together in the contract, but the prices you would return would be like an array 0, 0, 1. But I don't think you necessarily need to like do it differently. You could just say and or correctly in your yes or no question. So if all of them need to be hit, you would just say and. If only some of them, you could say or. Right?
So
Yeah, but you would still only be returning like P0, P1, or P2.
Well, you would return the value from the ancillary data. I thought you could define the ancillary data to return a particular value. So it doesn't need to be like 0 or 1 or 0.5. It could be like an array of values. Right? Could you say like, give me like an array then of like these values, and you just define what that's supposed to be?
Yeah, I think so. But I think if we allowed for that, then there would need to be instructions there for that, in my opinion. Like, I don't think there's like some language in here around like if the ancillary data doesn't follow like the format specified, then just default to returning 0.5. I think I said 0.5 at all times. So I think we just need to allow for like some flexibility, but yeah.
Okay, but this, generalized KPI options, that would be like separate UMIP, right? Not mixing with this one, right?
Agreed, but I was just providing an example of like a situation where you might want to like have your price be determined by like multiple things, like John said.
Sean, do you always have to have the auxiliary data defined up front, or could you have it so that you asked as many questions as you liked? Or would you have to say there are only going to be 3 questions?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, what do you mean by defined up front?
In the UMIP. So for example, in this UMIP, there's only like 4 pieces of auxiliary data. There's Q, P1, P2, P3, yeah?
Correct.
Can you have effectively infinite numbers of auxiliary data if you loop them back round? So you can have Q1, well, it doesn't work here, but the first question answers 1 to 3. The second question answers 1 to 3, but as many of those as you like.
Yeah, and we saw that with like the SpaceX price identifier. So not an infinite amount. It needs to be below the character limit, but we saw that in like the SpaceX price identifier, where they didn't define the amount of like launches they would pass in or the amount of weights they would pass in, but just the fact that each launch and weight would be incremented by 1. So yeah.
Oh, excellent.
And that's kind of what I was proposing.
So I guess if it was getting like really complicated, like the instructions I would think would need to get passed in the ancillary data. So you would ask your question, then you would have some additional instructions on like, here's the kind of complicated way to get to your values of P1, P2, and P3. But as it's getting more complicated, eventually you'll hit like a bytes limit, or it just won't be worth your time and you should just have a separate UMIP for that anyway.
I think we should also, do you think we should allow for instructions to be passed in? Like, what if the instructions contradicted the methodology within the UMIP?
Well, how would they do that?
If it wasn't a straightforward sum, like if the value of each yes or no mattered individually, then that wouldn't work with this one. But we could, in theory, have a different binary methodology that can account for specific yes and no's, and then put the burden of the instructions in the person who's making the query.
Yeah. I'm just
Fine.
thinking like if it.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say like, so let's say you had like the three things in the example. It's like TVL and no hacking and no liquidations. And one of those is indeterminate because you can't like tell exactly like how the TVL was or something. Then you would also need to have like all of these caveats and the instructions that are also like, if one of these is indeterminate, then do like this thing. So I think it would actually then get so complicated that if you were planning to do something like that, that it wouldn't really work with this identifier. So you would do something else. So I guess that does make sense. Like it needs to be either like a different generalized one, or these are just, this is a complicated one. And so you just need to go and like deal with this separately through its own UMIP.
Yeah.
Can you also have internal logic? So supposing you had 3 questions, could you then have an additional data field that basically returns the sum of them?
What do you mean?
Well, I think
that isn't voted on. Well, suppose you had like John's example, no, no, yes. That would be 0, 0, 1. Yeah. So actually your answer is 1. But it's a calculated value. It's not something that people are being asked to put in. Can you have that in auxiliary data that isn't something that's actually being asked?
The calculated value?
Yes. Like adding up how many yes votes there are.
Yeah, so basically sounded like John's proposal was to include like those instructions within the ancillary data. My proposal was kind of to include the instructions within the UMIP and allow for less flexibility.
Okay.
Right, John? Is that what I was hearing?
yeah. Yeah, I think that sums it up.
Sums it up.
Haha. Wait.
Hey guys, Hexy here. Would it work in the combination? Like the ancillary data, we need to clearly define where that come from, right? So I think the composition can happen at the ancillary data querying time, where you can say, get ancillary data for A and B and C and perform this and or operand against all the 3 results and call that specific operation out in the UMIP. The end result is still going to be a binary answer, but the complexity and composability is absorbed in both the UMIP as well as the ancillary data, because we can have multiple ancillary source, if I understood this correctly.
So yeah, so you're saying like define some sort of logic function like within the ancillary data?
Yeah, and then each logic function would have some sort of source for the yes or no's, right? So all of them can be defined and calculated together, and that calculation itself would be captured in the UMIP so that there's no like ambiguity around it.
Yeah,
I'm aiming for a way that we can disambiguate the computation, but also absorb the complexity of kind of a composition of yes and no's. I think both are very valid use cases. We need to support in a single UMIP.
So when you say like make the calculation less ambiguous, you're saying like pass in like a data source for each question as well.
Yeah. So for example, did TVL hit? Did I get hacked? Say you need like two sources, but you also need to perform like an OR operation on top of the answer for these two, and you call that your final like yes or no. Is it hacked, and did TVO hit a target? These are binary ancillary data sources, but on top of this data sources that you get, you still need to perform a logical operation on top of it. I think all three can be defined in the UMIP, and you end up with a yes or no result in the end.
Mm. Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this is that you could take it to the extreme where this is basically like, this is how computers work. Like you have and, or, and XOR, and you can like define the logic to like extreme levels of precision. And then this is going to spit out either yes or no. So somebody could theoretically say like, here are the values, here's the script to run this in Python. And then like
right.
if it's yes on the other end, or if it's no, or if it's indeterminate because one of the questions was like, like some philosophical thing, then it would still come out like indeterminate, I guess. So I could see this being like hacked, not hacked in a bad way, but like stretched to like that extreme or like anywhere in between, just because logic allows you to do that. But I'm not sure we necessarily want to encourage that, because then that's kind of like a pain in the ass. Although it is like kind of interesting, the idea of like passing in a really simple script and some simple values and then having people run that script, like that is kind of a cool idea, but also kind of a side track of, I think, Sean, what you wanted to talk about with all of this. But it could eventually go that way.
No,
yes. Sorry, absolutely not related with this one, but I think in the future it might be a good idea to use this type of thing, like passing, for example, expression price feed configuration as part of ancillary data, and then you can actually avoid creating new UMIPs for lots of stuff and just build upon existing building blocks. Of course, before that, we would need to agree on what and how to pass this kind of script to the voters. But I think it would be possible, and definitely this might be a useful use case.
That's literally exactly what I was going to say, Rainus. That's a great point. Like, I think following up on this one in the next couple of weeks or so, like we're going to start thinking about like generalized crypto pair UMIPs, so that you can just have one price identifier for the price of any cryptocurrency, right? And I think there are like two approaches that you could use for that. Like one would be passing in something like the expression price feed, where you would be defining like the exact markets, like the exact like types of pairs that you're trying to look for and all of that, and like other parameters about the price you're trying to request. But then the other one would be just defining like a methodology within the UMIP, like find the three highest like monthly volume exchanges and like use those for like this recognizable like token. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
I think circling back though to Sean, like your idea of making it more like a standard methodology in the UMIP, explaining how to return these multiple values, it might be promising to look at this and or XOR kind of logic thing and say you're getting these values, now combine them and like specify how you're going to wind up with like 1 or 0 or indeterminate, because that's really, well, actually, I guess that doesn't really help you because you're talking about like summing the values. So never mind. It's not about like taking multiple values and then figuring out whether it's yes or no. It's like, I don't know. Yeah, maybe you could actually define this through like some set of like example logical things you could pass at the end of your question. Like if it's yes to 2, but no for 1, then sum it in this way. And that could just literally be an equation that's thrown in at the end.
Yeah, the equation's interesting.
Because that would be like the, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think people agree that it's potentially useful to be able to pass like multiple things in, right? Pass multiple questions in, but like in our options for how to resolve the price after the questions are either allow for a function to be passed within ancillary data or just define like a generalized function within the UMIP, right?
Yeah, I just don't know how a generalized function would work though.
It'd be something, it wouldn't be like generalized, I guess. That's a bad word for it. It'd be something simple, like just sum up the values of all P answers. And something that'd be useful for would be something like the SpaceX price identifier that we just passed. Like that would be unnecessary.
So when you say sum up the values of all P answers, like because there's multiple yes or no questions, and then I guess what trips me up is like the output, I think, from this UMIP is it's either yes or no, or we can't tell. And then you could have some differentiation between what the values are in that. And so I feel like that needs to be like a function that's passed in with a particular question, because otherwise that's like redefining what P1, P2, and P3 are, right? Unless I'm misunderstanding.
So P1, P0, P1, and P2, or is it P1, P2, P3? They're still the same for all of like the individual items within like the array of question answer values, right?
Yeah.
And you could still have fallbacks defined for P0, P1, P2 values if for some reason like ancillary data was not passed in correctly. Yeah. Or people like wanted to choose to not respond. You could still have default values for the prices you could return. The idea would be, go ahead, Vari.
I think there might be a bit of a trade-off here between how useful we can make the UMIPs compared to how complicated it is to actually write the contracts. That if we make the UMIP too flexible and have the potential to have all this logic in it that people are required to fill in, then that actually may cause problems at the contract deployment level, where people are filling in stuff wrongly.
Yeah, I think more concerning for us would be causing problems at settlement where these things become extremely complicated and difficult to determine when they're already like asking potentially non-deterministic questions. But yeah, I agree. There's a huge trade-off between flexibility and complexity here. And I think we'll have that with all of our ancillary data UMIPs, which is interesting.
So I guess if you were doing a generalized one where you're sending a basket of yes or no questions in there that each have maybe their own logic for returning values based on whether it's yes, no, or indeterminate, that's what you're trying to define. Like you would say like, this is like, I don't know if you just like put it in an array to make it clear and it's just like Q, question 1, P1, P2, P3, or like Q1 and then the first question and so on. And then just summing those,
I guess.
and
I don't know.
Yeah, because that's kind of interesting. I mean, basically that is the weird thing. Like we're building a computer now because this is like binary queries. So it's like writing like a very simple like language for a logical expression here. So I could actually see that being useful. So then just wrapping it in an array and then it's clear like, okay, this is broken out into different sections. But then I think you still wind up with like an equation at the end where you have the outputs from like each of the things in the array. And if there's no equation passed, maybe it's summing it by default. And if there is an equation passed, then run the equation with like the outputs from like 3 questions.
Yeah.
I think that's a
Yeah.
way to go with that. And that could still stay in like a level where somebody could still theoretically do this by hand. Outside of like certain things like getting a bunch of like average prices over like several months of like crypto or something, but you know, that's a separate issue. But it's not like this inscrutable thing where it's like, here, run this on your computer now. Like you still get what's going on there as a human being.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Just because I don't have the technical knowledge. When does something get passed in as ancillary data? Is it when you deploy a contract, or is it when you make a price request?
So it's always when somebody actually makes a price request. For like some of the UMIP contracts that you think about, like the expiring multi-party or the long short pair contract or the perpetual, that ancillary data that will eventually be passed in the price request should be set on deployment. So it can't like change after the contract's been deployed and people have started to interact with it. But like theoretically, when using the optimistic oracle, people can define any sort of ancillary data for any sort of price identifier that they pass in.
Yes, but it can be like different. It depends really on the contract. It can be fixed, or you can leave it open that anybody can change this question. And it just depends on the use case, whether or not users would actually feel safe if the question being asked can be changed after deployment. Maybe for some cases it's useful, but for others it's not. But the UMIP itself is not restricting on that. It's up calling contract creators to decide how to use it.
Okay, so the contract establishes what has to be included in the ancillary data that you submit when you do a price request. Is that right?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay.
Why would you want to change the question once the contract's been deployed, Renus?
No, so that it's theoretically possible. Maybe that there are the question is on the series of events which you don't know yet. For example, on this Space X launch, when we looked at it, the naming of the launch is not known precisely in the future, and only when time passes on you can know the precise name of the exact like launch. That's as an example when you might need to adjust at least some of the bits, but it really depends, I think, on use case.
Yeah, I understand. I would just see that as a security risk. That if you think that you're interacting with a contract that asks one question, but then, you know, behind the scenes they change the question.
Yeah, sure. I think it definitely has to be in some controlled way. Absolutely.
Yeah. But like from the Oracle side of things or DVM side of things, it doesn't really matter to us all that much, right? It's just we respond to whatever question is being asked, potentially, or we respond cannot be determined.
I think I actually really like the idea now of having a standardized way of dealing with like baskets of questions, and then also like having a script to have like varied response depending on like something passed in. For this right now, I think we would still have backwards compatibility. Like if we passed binary query as is right now, it would work for just like normal questions, like did the Dallas Mavericks win the NBA Finals, yes or no? And then if we followed on with another UMIP that kind of expands the functionality and also adds some details on like, here's how you pass in multiple questions and tell us how to deal with the outputs of each of those questions and then return that, that would still work. And we could even keep the same identifier, I think, because if you're passing in questions the old way, you still have all of the same defaults. It's like optional complexity, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that might be a worthwhile approach, because I think this could be really powerful, since it is just this like basic like binary computation primitive that we're adding now to like spend a little bit more time thinking about the best way to do it, and then just add on the additional features while keeping backwards compatibility but not delaying this one, is kind of the way I feel about it. But
Yeah,
what do you all think?
I definitely agree. Like, I don't think, like, I think there's a lot of value in the simplicity of this one as well. It's like one input, 3 potential answers. And yeah, I'd rather just keep it as is for now. And we were getting into some like much more complicated stuff, and I think it could be like something really powerful to explore, but I kind of want to keep it separate for now.
Yeah. I
Also,
think
we wouldn't be trying to review the creation of a new computer primitive within like a day and a half. So
Create and review.
yes.
Yeah, I think it would be desirable if we did just have a simple one, because I think that the complexity that you're getting into might confuse people. And so you could have like the basic one and the ones with all the bells and whistles. Also, I know that BasketDAO are kind of looking to use this one quite quickly. So I'd prefer that we got this one passed and then we had a bit more time to consider the design of the more complex ones.
Sounds like a good approach to me.
Is everyone good for this? Good to go? Anything else?
This was really interesting.
This was.
I think it went a very unexpected direction, but I like it. I'm more excited than ever about this as a building block to our DVM computation engine. We've now given the DVM the power of a Turing complete computer.
Excellent. That was all the UMIPs for today. Some people might have seen that there's a new guide, a new collateral currency template up there. What we've done for that is to take out to simply be able to add a collateral currency only with 3 bits of information, with the contract address, with the token, with token contract address, and the final store fee. And then we'll have not auxiliary data, we'll have guidance on our docs site that will suggest to contract creators how it should be used. There's a first draft of guidance up there. Sean, I noticed you put up some comments on it, but I haven't really had time to look. So it would be great if people took a look over that. So if there was any other addition that they would like to add to that guidance, or any amendments that they would like to make. Ideally, we'd like to turn this into a living document so that with experience, we can provide more and better guidance for contract deployers on how to best use our currencies, because we are accepting that we are kind of introducing a level of risk here, and there's a bit of buyer beware on using whatever collateral currency people add. I don't know if people are aware of this, have taken a look at it, but just to let people know.
Cool. Thank you, Ari.
I did have just one question on that. Is it reasonable for us to ask people to sort of provide how they arrived at their final fee submission as a part of their request, just as kind of a useful tool for whoever is going to use that collateral type in a contract to help them understand why it was selected? Or is that too much to ask?
I think it's actually a very good idea. But I mean, we are trying to cut down complexity, so I would say that we wouldn't insist on it. But for weird tokens that aren't traded, that have a variety of ways where you can decompose it and get it back into dollars or Bitcoin or Ethereum or something normal, knowing the route that they took to calculate a final fee gives an indication of a route that we might take in order to calculate a value for it.
Yeah, exactly. That was kind of sort of what I was going for there. Because when I'm working on the audit, there are some that I'm like, I don't even know how to tell what this is worth right now because it's not on any of the like major available places to go look. So I just thought that might be helpful, but I know that also does go against the making it easier bit as well.
Well, I think it could also just be like, literally, what did you do to calculate the final fee? So more often than not, the answer would be based on the price on GitHub, or not GitHub, on CoinGecko. And then somebody could add more details if it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, and that would be perfect. Just something so that we know like why they threw that number out there if we aren't sure how they did the calculation, just to point us in the right direction.
Yeah, and I don't think it adds too much overhead. It's just literally like I went to this website, unless it is something weird.
Also, it only adds overhead to the ones that probably need more overhead. I think it still accomplishes the same goal of just like, if it's straightforward, then you can just throw them in there.
But the rest of the guides, I think you said this just a moment ago, Vari, the rest of the guide is actually more intended for the contract deployer, right?
Yes,
As they're
that's
doing
right.
it. Okay, cool.
So the idea would be that anyone can basically put up any collateral currency and get it approved. But that if a contract deployer wanted to use that collateral currency, they should probably look at the guidelines and use the guidelines to see which kind of contracts would be appropriate, which kinds would not be. So, I mean, you know, there's no real security risk with using something for KPI options, but there probably is on things that require liquidators and like the EMP.
Yep. The differentiation there is that one is like that it's like contract risk rather than protocol risk necessarily. So it's more about just like redefining the hard requirements around like what actually matters for like the protocol itself rather than, you know, specific contracts. But that is a very long discussion that we could get into. Also, up in the price identifier template is like a doc that defines like examples around ancillary data and some requirements around ancillary data format and stuff like that. So if you're looking for answers on that, it's in the price identifier guide now.
Is that the guide on GitHub, Sean?
No, sorry, the price identifier template in the UMIPs repo.
Excellent. Cheers.
Cheers. All right.
Anything else anyone wants to raise? Cool. Well, it was good to see you all, and thank you all again for turning up.
Thanks, Barry.
Bye.
See ya.
Ciao.